Hello and welcome to another session of Learning Kyma, my learning path to Kyma. Today we have a bit of a different episode because I want to take a look at some special topic that's not directly connected to Kyma, but maybe of interest because Kyma is also about serverless, it's about function as a service. And I will now do another deployment of something serverless, function as a service, but of Azure Functions. Now you might ask yourself, Azure Functions, what? They are the function as a service offering on Azure, right? Aren't they? Yes, that's right. But they are open source from day one, and they are kind of also able to run within a container. I have highlighted, or I will give that out in the show notes. Here I have the documentation of Azure Functions, and there is one section of deploying a function app to Kubernetes. So as Kyma is Kubernetes based, why shouldn't we try out and see if we can deploy an Azure function to Kubernetes, or to Kyma to be more precise. So where do we start? Well, we start from the command line. I have here a little directory called container function. And what I will do now, I will use the Azure Function Cli, which gives you quite some convenience options for creating functions and also creating functions with Docker files. So what we do now is func init. So we will initialize this repository for a function, and we will say --docker, which will create kind of the skeleton in order to create a function. Now this will ask me about the worker runtime. I want a Node worker runtime, and I want to have it in JavaScript. We will in a minute see why this is the case. So it creates some files. So let's check out this repository. So we have here our files that we just created. So for those of you who have been working with other functions, nothing completely new. We have a host.json, and we have, this is new, a Docker file. And this Docker file simply describes where to fetch the base image, and then doing some things in order to build up the image and hook in our custom code. Now, as you can see, we do not yet have any custom code. So what we need to do is create a function, and we can do that also via command line, via func new. So we want to create a new function. Now this will ask us some questions. So how can the function be triggered? We will use an HTTP trigger because that's the simplest way to do that. We will give it a name. We will call it a Kyma function because it will be running on Kyma. And yeah, that's already it because the runtime information, etc. was already there. So let's take a look what happened. We have now one folder with a function.json file, which describes how the function is authorized. We will not use function, which is the default value, where you need a function key. We will use anonymous. We will also only allow a get method, and the rest we will leave. So we get a request in based on our HTTP trigger, and we get a result object back via HTTP. The index.json is kind of the core of the function. So I don't know if this is large enough. Yeah, that looks good. So what do we have here? A query is received, And whether this query contains a name parameter or there's a name parameter within the body, the response will be correspondingly. We will adopt that a bit from Kyma in both cases. Okay, so we have now this this function set up. Let's check if it's running. So we will now do a Func Start, which will kick off the local function runtime, and will give us a localhost HTTP endpoint where we can check if it's running. So here we go. We have an HTTP triggered function from Kyma. And if I now hand in the parameter name, then this will tell me that everything is fine. So yeah, that's okay, that's good. We will stop the function now, clear it. So that should be it. As you can see, it's not case sensitive how I called it, so that's not an issue. Okay, so what do we have to do next? We have to build a Docker image, push the Docker image to our Docker hub, to our container registry, and then do a deployment to Kyma. So we will make that as we did it the last time. So we will create a makefile where we'll put in all our commands for building that one. We will take that from our sample extension.net that we had the last time. So we will copy that one, put that in. Now we have a sample Azure function. That's good. The Docker account remains the same. Everything's fine, so we can also run it locally. I will not do that for the sake of time. We did that last time. So we will now push the image. Yeah, so we will make push image, which will now create our image, and we'll push it to the Docker hub registry. As you can see, that's not too small, so there are quite some things that need to be pushed to the Docker registry. This takes a bit of a time, so we can continue with working on the other things that we need to do. So what do we need to do? Well, we need a namespace, so we want to put it into a dedicated namespace. So let's open up our Kyma console. Don't forget to fetch the right configuration, and we will add a new namespace. We call it test function. We don't put in any labels, and we will create it. Okay, so here we have our test function. That looks good. Let's go back to our editor. No, I want the other one. So we have our namespace. Now we need our deployment files. So we need a folder. Let's call it Kubernetes. Let's put in a new file called deployment.yaml. And now let's just copy the stuff that we did last time, because there is no difference in the syntax. So we will take this one, copy it here. So we create a deployment, we create a service, and in addition, we will also create an API rule in order to make our service accessible. Okay, now we need to change all the names because we are not working on the sample extension.net, but we are working on the sample Azure function. So let's simply make a search and replace thingy here. So let's see, that's okay. We only need one replica. We do not want to do anything fancy here. We don't need any environment variables. Service looks good. And then we have the API rule. We want no authentication, that's right. We just want to support the get HTTP verb. And we expose port 80, that's consistent all over the place. Okay, so our YAML file looks okay. Let's format it so that everything's nice and neat for the deployment. That's good. Okay, so let's see how far we went with pushing. Yep, it's pushed to the registry. That's fine. So let's cross check. We can close that one. We can go to Docker Hub, refresh it. And here we have our sample Azure function. That's good. Okay, we go to our namespaces. We have our test function namespace. Everything is here, no pods. Let's see if I can hook up there. So let's see, kubectl -n test function. Get pod, so it should not return anything. So there are no resources in that namespace. So we can now apply our file, which is in the Kubernetes folder. It's called deployment YAML, to this namespace, which should push everything right there. So yeah. One hint that I came across when I tried out those stuff. So if you create the namespace and instantaneously push your deployment to that new namespace that is not default, you might get some kind of cryptic error message that an internal server error appeared. I think that there is some time needed until all the internal mechanics for setting up the namespace are in place. Even though you can log into the admin overview. So if you run into that error, just wait a bit. So create the namespace first, then wait a bit, and then make the deployment. And yeah, here we go. So we should have a deployed function. We should have the pod running. We should have a service. Okay, that looks good. And we should have an API rule in place which points to our Azure function. Now let's see what happens if we call that one. Oh, okay, that's funny. So what we have here is we have an endpoint that directly points to the Azure Function runtime, which has kind of a default screen that tells you, hey, your function app is running, and it's running on the 3.0 function runtime version. Now, what we need now is the same endpoint as before that we have, which was API, and then we had Kyma function. And if I do not make a typo, this should now go to that endpoint. We did not switch on any authentication, so that's why we can directly go through, and we can now also do the same game as before. So I hand in a query parameter, And here we go. Nice. So what we have now is an Azure function, a function as a service offering of Microsoft. So it's open source, but it's kind of pushed by Microsoft, running in our Kyma cluster as a function as a service. Now, what I do not want is to have somebody access to that area. So let's tweak the API rule, the API rule a bit. So we have this rule here, that's fine, but we want to have an access strategy that only allows us access to API slash Kyma function. I copy it so that I don't make any typo. Okay, we save it. So now we allow via the micro gateway only an access via this endpoint and not via the generic root endpoint. So if I now refresh that page, I have no access because it cannot be found. If I refresh that page, everything is fine because I have adopted the API rule so that I can only hit that endpoint. So as I look over there, I think we should dim down the light a bit. Otherwise I'm kind of glowing. Okay, so that's cool. So what we have now is we have now deployed an Azure function to Kyma. So we have now a function as a service running on Kyma, which is not Knative. We'll talk about Knative and doing this development in another episode. Now, what would be interesting is how do we scale that stuff? Because containers and especially functions as a service are all about scaling, right? So they scale up and they scale down. They scale up to the point in order to meet the demand, and they scale down in the perfect case to 0 if there is no demand at all. So the next thing that we should look into before we move on is how do we scale workloads on Kyma, on Kubernetes, right? So yeah, I would say this is it for this episode now, because we wanted to focus on Azure Functions, deploy Azure Functions to Kyma. But we have some, well, teaser. So in the next section, we want to check out how can we scale our pods, how can we scale our workloads that we brought to Kyma. So that was it. Deploying a kind of, well, exotic workload to Kyma that some of you might not have expected. It's easy with Azure Functions, and as you could see, the function CLI is really super convenient in order to get things running really fast. Kyma also doesn't make your life too difficult. So yeah, that's quite a decent experience. Nevertheless, we want to know more about this scaling thingy, and this will then be the next episode. Until then, I wish you all the best. Bye.